The night was dark on planet X-427. Strange purple clouds covered all three moons, making the forest below pitch black. The only sounds were the rustling of alien leaves and the heavy breathing of someone running through the darkness. Zara stumbled through the woods, holding her bleeding arm. Her blue skin was covered in cuts, and her silver hair was tangled with leaves and branches. She wasn't from this world. She was the last survivor of her species, and right now she was running for her life. Behind her, something growled. Then another growl came from her left, and another from her right. The monsters of this planet had found her scent, and they were closing in. Zara's mind flashed back to just 2 hours ago. She had been safely traveling in her small ship, carrying the last records of her destroyed homeworld. Everything had been quiet until the ship's alarms started blaring. Something had hit the engine, and she was falling fast toward this unknown planet. The crash had been terrible. Metal pieces flew everywhere as her ship hit the ground and split apart. The emergency systems had saved her life, but she was hurt badly. Worse, she could smell the fuel leaking from the broken engine. She had to get away before the ship exploded. That's when she first heard them, the hunting calls of this planet's predators. They had smelled her blood and were coming to investigate. Zara grabbed her small emergency bag and ran into the forest. She didn't know where she was going, but anywhere was better than staying near the crash. Now, 2 hours later, she was getting weaker. Her arm wouldn't stop bleeding, and her legs felt heavy. The glowing plants around her cast weird shadows that made everything look scarier. Every few steps, she had to lean against a tree to catch her breath. A twig snapped nearby. Zara froze. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound. 2 red eyes glowed in the darkness. Then 4 more appeared. Then 8. The creatures were silent now, but she could see their shapes in the dim light. They were big, bigger than her, with long claws and rows of sharp teeth that glinted in the faint light of the glowing plants. Zara backed away slowly. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. She reached into her bag, hoping to find something, anything, she could use as a weapon. But there was nothing except some medical supplies and the small data crystal containing her people's history. The creatures moved closer. They walked on 4 legs, but their front paws were more like hands with sharp claws. Their faces looked like a mix between earth wolves and lizards, though Zara had never seen earth animals except in old data files. She kept backing up until something hard stopped her. It was a cliff wall. She was trapped. The monsters had driven her exactly where they wanted her. They were smarter than she had thought. One of the creatures made a sound that was almost like a laugh. It knew they had won. Zara pressed herself against the rock wall. She was the last of her kind. All of her people's history, their culture, their knowledge, it would all die with her here on this strange planet. The leader of the pack crouched down, getting ready to jump. Zara closed her eyes. At least she would see her family again. Suddenly, a bright light blazed through the darkness. It was so bright that Zara had to cover her eyes. The monsters howled, not in triumph, but in pain and fear. The light was hurting their sensitive eyes. A loud humming sound filled the air. It was getting closer. The monsters backed away from the light, snarling in confusion. The humming got louder and louder until it was right above them. Zara looked up, squinting against the bright light. Through the trees, she could see something big hovering in the sky. It wasn't another monster. It was a ship. The last thing Zara saw before she passed out from blood loss was a rope ladder dropping down from the bright light, and a shape climbing down it. The shape looked almost like her people, but different. It walked on 2 legs and had pink skin instead of blue. It was something she had only read about in the old stories. It was a human. Then everything went black. John Carter wasn't supposed to be anywhere near planet X-427. As a cargo hauler pilot, his route was simple: pick up mining supplies from Station 9, deliver them to the outer colonies, and head back. No detours, no exceptions. But the strange distress signal had changed everything. Now he stood in the alien forest, his emergency plasma rifle ready, looking down at the unconscious blue-skinned alien girl. She was unlike anything he'd seen in his 15 years of space travel. Her silver hair seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and the markings on her skin pulsed weakly with a soft light. "Well, this sure isn't in the cargo hauler manual," he muttered, keeping one eye on the retreating monsters. His ship, the Lucky Star, hovered above them, its spotlight keeping the predators at bay. But the light wouldn't last forever. The power cells were already at 60% and dropping. John's medical scanner beeped as he checked her wounds. The screen showed strange readings he'd never seen before. Her blood wasn't red like humans. It was a shimmering purple that seemed to move on its own. Even more strange, the scanner showed 2 hearts in her chest, both beating too fast. A howl echoed through the trees. Different from the wolf lizard monsters, something bigger was coming. "Time to go, Blue," John said, carefully lifting the alien girl. She was surprisingly light, almost as if her bones were hollow like a bird's. As he touched her skin, images suddenly flashed through his mind. A beautiful crystal city, explosions in the sky, people running, ships falling from space. Then darkness. John shook his head, trying to clear it. "Telepathic too, huh? You're just full of surprises." The rope ladder swayed as he climbed one-handed, holding the girl with his other arm. The howls were getting closer. Through the trees, he could see new shapes moving. Tall creatures that walked on 2 legs, with long arms that reached the ground. Their heads looked like earth-praying mantises, but much, much bigger. Just as John reached his ship's entry hatch, one of the mantis creatures burst through the trees. It was at least 20 feet tall. Instead of a mouth, it had what looked like a flower made of teeth. It reached for the ship with its long arms. "Oh no, you don't." John slapped the emergency thrusters button. The Lucky Star shot upward, the sudden movement making the rope ladder snap. The mantis creature's claws missed them by inches. Inside the ship, John quickly put the alien girl on his small medbay bed. The autodoc started scanning her immediately, but all its screens showed unknown species. Canoti ferocious. Great, John sighed. He'd have to treat her wounds the old-fashioned way. As he cleaned and bandaged her injuries, he noticed something odd. The girl wore a necklace with a crystal that looked exactly like the ones used to power his ship's engines. But this crystal was different. Inside it, he could see what looked like moving pictures, thousands of them, all swirling together. Suddenly, the girl's eyes snapped open. They were completely silver, with no pupils. She sat up fast, looking around in panic. When she saw John, she pressed herself against the wall, her markings glowing brighter with fear. Hey, it's okay," John said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. Look." He pointed to her bandaged arm. "I helped you." The girl looked at her arm, then back at John. Slowly, her markings dimmed to a soft glow. She touched her necklace, and the crystal lit up. A hologram appeared between them, a perfect 3D image of the crash site. "Your ship?" John asked. "You want to go back?" The girl nodded, then made another hologram, this time showing the crystal exploding, with more monsters appearing around it. "Let me guess," John said. "If we don't get back there soon, something very bad is going to happen." The ship's alarm suddenly blared. On the main screen, dozens of heat signatures appeared, all moving toward the crash site. The alien girl's eyes went wide with fear. She made one more hologram, showing an army of the mantis creatures, all emerging from glowing crystal eggs. "Oh," John said, "that kind of very bad." The Lucky Star drifted in the upper atmosphere of planet X-427, hidden inside a thick purple cloud. Below them, more and more mantis creatures gathered near the crash site, their flower teeth glowing in the darkness. Inside the ship's med bay, John watched in amazement as the alien girl, who had managed to communicate that her name was Zora, did something impossible. Her silver hair floated in the air as if she was underwater, and her glowing markings created patterns of light that danced across the walls. Purple drops of her blood floated up from her wounds, formed into perfect spheres, and then flowed back into her body. The cuts sealed themselves, leaving no scars. "That's one way to save on bandages," John said. Zara smiled for the first time. She touched her crystal necklace again, creating a hologram that showed her people healing even worse injuries. But then the image changed to show thousands of crystal necklaces being destroyed, and her smile faded. John pointed to his ship's engine room through the door. "Your crystal looks just like my engine crystals. Same color, same shape. But yours is special, isn't it?" Instead of answering with a hologram, Zara did something new. She touched John's forehead with one finger, and suddenly he wasn't in his ship anymore. He was standing in a massive library made of living crystal. Alien writing floated in the air everywhere he looked. Thousands of Zara's people walked through halls filled with technology he couldn't understand. In the center, a huge crystal tree grew through all the floors, its branches holding millions of smaller crystals like the one around Zora's neck. "This was your home," John whispered. "And those crystals, they were your people's memories." The vision changed. Dark ships appeared in the sky, shooting beams that turned the crystals black. Zara's people fought back with weapons made of light, but they were outnumbered. The crystal tree began to die. In the chaos, John saw young Zora running through the library. The older aliens handed her the special necklace crystal and pushed her toward an escape pod. She was crying, reaching back toward them as the pod's door closed. The vision ended. John found himself back in his ship, his eyes wet with tears. Zora was crying too, her tears floating up like tiny diamonds before disappearing. A loud bang shook the ship. The mantis creatures were throwing something. On the ship's screen, John saw what they were using as weapons. Eggs, but not normal eggs. These were made of the same black crystal that had destroyed Zora's world. Wherever they hit the ship's hull, frost began to spread. "They're trying to freeze us," John realized. But why? What do they want? Zora created another hologram, more detailed than before. It showed the mantis creatures emerging from black crystals, spreading across worlds like a virus. Behind them, pulling their strings, was a shadow shape that made John's head hurt just looking at it. Then she showed something else, her necklace crystal glowing, pushing back the darkness, healing infected worlds. Hope against the shadow. "You're not just carrying memories," John said. "That crystal is a weapon against them." The last one. The ship's temperature dropped. Ice crackled across the windows. The mantis creatures were getting better at their aims. But Zara had an idea. She pointed at John's engine room again, then at her crystal. She made a hologram showing the two types of crystals combining, creating an explosion of light that drove the monsters away. "That could work," John said. "But your crystal, wouldn't that destroy all your people's memories?" Zara nodded sadly. She showed one last image, a galaxy filled with mantis creatures and shadow shapes, compared to a galaxy free but without her people's history. John understood. Sometimes the price of survival was letting go of the past. Another egg hit them. The ship's power began to fail. "Okay," John said, standing up. "Let's give these bugs a light show they'll never forget." But as they headed to the engine room, the ship's sensors detected something new. Something massive was rising from the planet's surface, something that made the mantis creatures look tiny. And it was looking right at them. The massive shape rising from planet X427's surface wasn't just one creature. It was thousands of mantis creatures fused together into a living tower of teeth and claws. At its center, a giant black crystal pulsed like a dark heart. "That's different," John said, his hands tight on the ship's controls. Zara's markings flashed rapidly, her people's version of panic. She created a hologram showing the creature's true form. a living hive-mind weapon designed by the shadow beings to harvest entire worlds. The black crystal at its core corrupted everything it touched, turning life forms into crystal-infected monsters that joined the hive. The ship's engines whined as John dodged another volley of black crystal eggs. The ice coating their hull was getting thicker. Then something weird happened. The frozen areas began to change shape, growing into jagged crystal spikes that pointed inward. They're not trying to freeze us, John realized. They're trying to turn my ship into one of them. Zara suddenly grabbed his arm. Her eyes glowed brighter than ever as she shared another vision. Deep beneath the planet's surface, a massive chamber held hundreds of sleeping hive towers. If this one fully awakened, it would wake the others. Then they would spread across the galaxy, unstoppable. The vision ended just as the ship's right engine died. They began to spiral downward. Engine room. Now, John shouted. They ran through the freezing corridors. The black crystal was spreading faster, growing through the walls like evil vines. When a crystal spike nearly impaled John, Zara pushed him aside. Her hand glowed with silver light as she touched the crystal, temporarily turning it clear and harmless. "You can purify them?" John asked as they ran. Zara nodded, but her tired expression showed it cost her energy each time she did it. They reached the engine room just as the lights failed. The only illumination came from the engine's power crystals and Zara's glowing markings. John's emergency flashlight revealed a horrifying sight. The black crystal had almost reached the engines. Zara quickly shared another vision. On her world, before its fall, her people had discovered that combining pure and corrupted crystals caused a massive energy pulse that could cleanse infection. But the pulse would destroy both crystals in the process. "If we overload my engine crystals and combine them with your memory crystal at just the right moment," John said, understanding the plan. The ship shuddered. Through the engine room window, they could see the hive tower reaching for them, with endless arms of fused mantis creatures. The black crystal infection had covered half the ship. Working together, they quickly removed the engine crystals. But when Zara tried to take off her memory crystal necklace, something strange happened. The crystal merged with her chest, sinking into her glowing markings. Her eyes went wide with surprise. She shared a quick vision memory. Long ago, her people had evolved alongside the crystals, developing a symbiotic relationship. The crystals weren't just tools, they were part of her people's biology. "So we can't remove your crystal," John said. "Which means?" Zara nodded sadly. "To create the pulse, she would have to be at the center of the explosion." The ship's hull screamed as the hive tower began crushing it. Black crystal covered everything except the engine room. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Then John had an idea. He pointed to the medical scanner he'd used earlier. "Your blood. It has the same properties as your crystal. If we combine my engine crystals with your blood instead of the memory crystal..." Zara's eyes lit up. She immediately cut her palm, letting the purple blood flow into a container. As she did, she showed John one last vision. Her people had a saying, "In our blood flows the light of memory. In our hearts beats the pulse of hope." John quickly wired the engine crystals into an overload sequence. The hive tower's giant eye peered through the window, its pupil made of writhing mantis creatures. The black crystal infection reached the engine room door. "Ready?" John asked, holding the container of purple blood. Zara nodded. Her markings glowed brighter than ever as she prepared to channel energy through her blood. The door burst open. Black crystal spikes shot toward them. The hive tower's eye blazed with dark energy. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. John threw the blood crystal mixture up just as Zara released a blast of silver light from her hands. The ship's engines detonated in a chain reaction. For a moment, everything was pure white light. Then the real chaos began. The explosion created something never seen before on planet X427, where John's engine crystals mixed with Zara's blood. A wave of prismatic light spread outward like a silent supernova. When it touched the black crystal infection, something extraordinary happened. Instead of destroying it, the light transformed it. The hive tower screamed as its dark heart shattered, but not into pieces, into butterflies. Thousands of crystal butterflies, each one glowing with rainbow light. The mantis creatures began to change too, breaking apart into smaller crystal creatures that floated away like dandelion seeds. John and Zara watched in awe from the remains of the Lucky Star. The ship was mostly destroyed, but the engine room where they stood had survived, protected by the energy wave. "That wasn't exactly what we expected," John said. Zara's markings pulsed with confusion and wonder. She created a hologram showing why this was impossible. The corrupted crystals should have been destroyed, not transformed. Then she showed another image. Deep underground, the sleeping hive towers were changing too, becoming crystal gardens full of new life. But their amazement was cut short. The ground began to shake. The shadow beings had noticed their failure, and they were angry. A dark tear opened in the sky. A portal. Through it came something that made the hive tower look tiny. A living shadow descended, its form constantly shifting between shapes that hurt to look at. Where it touched the ground, reality itself seemed to crack. Zara grabbed John's hand and shared an urgent vision. The shadow beings weren't just aliens, they were creatures from another dimension, one where crystals were consciousness itself. They had been jealous of her people's crystal symbiosis, wanting that power for themselves. Their black crystals were attempts to copy her people's abilities, but twisted by darkness. "So when your blood mixed with my crystals," John said, "it created a new kind of crystal life, one they couldn't control." Before Zara could answer, tentacles of living shadow shot toward them. But something unexpected happened. The crystal butterflies swarmed together, forming the shield of light. More transformed creatures joined them. Crystal birds, crystal flowers, even tiny crystal versions of the mantis creatures, all protecting John and Zara. Zara's markings suddenly began to change color, shifting through the rainbow like the new crystals. She touched her chest where her memory crystal had merged with her, and pulled out a seed, a living crystal seed glowing with every color imaginable. She quickly shared a vision. This seed contained not just her people's memories, but the potential for a new kind of crystal life, one that could resist the shadow beings. But to plant it, they needed to reach the heart of the planet where the original black crystals had first taken root. The shadow being roared in a frequency that shattered the remaining black crystals, but each shard transformed into more crystal life, joining the protective swarm around John and Zara. "Well," John said, picking up his plasma rifle which now had crystal butterflies perched on it, "I always wanted to visit the center of a planet. Any idea how to get there?" Zara smiled. She pointed to one of the transformed mantis creatures, now about the size of a horse and glowing with friendly light. More gathered behind it, ready to help. She created a hologram showing a massive tunnel system that led to the planet's core. The shadow being split into multiple forms, all attacking at once. The crystal creatures fought back, creating beautiful light shows with each clash. But they couldn't hold it off forever. Raced to the planet's core while being chased by dimension-hopping shadow monsters, John said, climbing onto the crystal mantis mount. "Should be fun." Zora mounted her own crystal creature, the seed pulsing with rainbow light in her hands. She shared a quick vision. If they succeeded, this planet would become a beacon, its crystal life spreading to protect other worlds from the shadows. If they failed, the shadows would learn how to corrupt this new crystal life, becoming more powerful than ever. A crystal butterfly landed on John's shoulder, its wings painting light patterns in the air that somehow formed words. "Hope flies on crystal wings." "Now that's just showing off," John grinned. Together, they rode into the tunnels, followed by their army of crystal creatures, as the shadows pursued them toward the heart of the world. The race to the planet's core was like riding through a dream made of crystals and nightmares. John and Zara galloped on their crystal mantis mounts through tunnels that twisted in impossible ways, while living shadows chased them, screaming in frequencies that made reality shiver. Their crystal creature army fought brilliantly. Crystal butterflies formed spinning shields of light. Crystal birds dive-bombed the shadows with rainbow beams. Even tiny crystal spiders wove webs of pure energy across the tunnels, slowing the shadow beings down. But the shadows were learning. They began absorbing the crystal creatures, not corrupting them, but understanding them. Each absorbed creature made the shadows stronger, more colorful, more real. "They're not just chasing us," John shouted as they rode deeper. "They're evolving." Zora's markings flashed in alarm. She shared a vision. The shadow beings had been studying her people for centuries, learning to exist in physical form. Now, with these new crystal life forms, they were completing their transformation. The crystal seed in Zara's hands pulsed faster as they went deeper, resonating with something below. The tunnel walls changed from rock to pure crystal, showing reflections of strange moments in time. The planet's birth, the first shadow arrival, the growth of the original crystal forest before it was corrupted. Suddenly, their mounts reared up. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber that defied physics. It was bigger on the inside than the entire planet, filled with floating islands of crystal connected by bridges of light. At the center, suspended in space, was a massive crystal heart, the planet's core. But they weren't alone. Hundreds of shadow beings had arrived first, using other tunnels. They surrounded the heart, merging together into something new. A colossal being of crystal-infused shadow, with 1,000 faces and wings made of darkness and rainbow light. "We understand now." It spoke, its voice a harmony of crystal sounds. "We become real." The crystal seed in Zara's hands began to crack. But instead of breaking, it opened like a flower, revealing a tiny galaxy of lights inside. She shared an urgent vision. The seed wasn't meant to be planted. It was meant to be transformed, just like everything else the light wave had touched. Your people, John realized. They didn't just store memories in crystals. They stored entire possibilities. The shadow crystal being reached for them, with hands made of star stuff and void. "Give us completion." But Zara had one last secret to share. She grabbed John's hand and sent him not a vision, but a truth. Her people hadn't been wiped out. They had evolved, becoming beings of pure crystal consciousness, seeding worlds with crystal life, waiting for the right moment, the right combination. She wasn't the last survivor. She was the first of something new. Zara's body began to crystallize, not like the corrupted crystals, but like living starlight. The crystal butterflies, birds, and other creatures swirled around her, adding their light to her transformation. She was becoming a bridge between flesh and crystal, shadow and light, possibility and reality. John's plasma rifle had crystallized too, becoming something else, a tool for transformation rather than destruction. He somehow knew exactly what to do. "Ready to rewrite some universal laws?" he asked, aiming at the crystal seed as Zara held it up. The shadow crystal being surged forward. "We will be real." "You've got it backwards," John said. "Time to get magical." He pulled the trigger just as Zara released all her power into the seed, just as the shadow being reached them, just as the planet's crystal heart pulsed. Reality held its breath. Then everything changed. When the crystal seed, Zara's power, John's crystallized weapon, the shadow beings, and the planet's heart all connected, something happened that rewrote the rules of existence itself. The universe hiccuped. Time split into crystal facets. John experienced everything at once. He saw Zara's people, not extinct but evolved into crystal beings, spreading seeds of possibility across galaxies. He saw the shadow beings' origin, creatures of pure thought, lonely in their formless dimension, watching the physical universe with envy. He saw the planet they now stood on, once a meeting point between dimensions before the shadows tried to force their way through. Reality crystallized around them like a kaleidoscope breaking apart and reforming. The massive shadow crystal being fragmented into millions of pieces, each one becoming something new, not corrupted, not transformed, but transcendent. The crystal heart of the planet pulsed with rainbow light, each beat creating new forms of life that existed between dimensions. Crystal dragons made of living mathematics soared through newly formed crystal skies. Gardens of crystal flowers grew in impossible colors, each blossom a window to another reality. Zara's crystalline form stabilized into something magnificent. She became a being of pure crystal light, but kept her humanoid shape, a bridge between all forms of existence. Her markings now wrote stories in the air with each pulse, telling tales in a language of light and shadow that all creatures could somehow understand. The shadow beings' thousand faces shifted into expressions of wonder, their desire to be real transformed as they realized a greater truth. Reality itself was changing to accommodate all forms of existence. We understand. Their voices chimed like crystal bells. Not conquest, convergence. John found himself changing too. The crystallized plasma rifle had merged with his arm, not as a weapon, but as a key that could unlock doors between states of being. His eyes now saw in spectrums that had never existed before. Then Zara shared one final vision, but not of the past or present. She showed John the future that was unfolding. The planet was becoming a nexus, a living university where physical beings, shadow beings, and crystal beings could meet and learn from each other. The crystal life they had created would spread, not as a conquering force but as an invitation. Each transformed world would become another classroom, another meeting point, another place of convergence. The crystal butterflies that had protected them now carried messages between dimensions. The mantis creatures became guardians of knowledge, their fractaled forms housing libraries of crystallized wisdom. Even the tiny crystal spiders wove webs between realities, creating highways for thought and consciousness to travel. So, John said, looking at his crystallized arm and then at the transformed shadow beings who now shimmered with possibility, I guess my cargo hauling days are over. Zara, in her light bridge form, created a message that hung in the air like a constellation. Only the cargo is changed. Now we carry understanding between worlds. The shadow beings, no longer dark but shining with their own inner light, added, "We will learn. We will teach. We will grow." The planet's crystal heart beat like a symphony of light, sending waves of transformation across the galaxy. But this time, the change wasn't forced or corrupted. It was an invitation, a possibility, a gift. John looked at his hands, one still flesh, one crystallized, and smiled. Well, beats hauling mining supplies. Across the cosmos, crystal seeds began to bloom. Shadow beings emerged from their dimension, not to conquer but to share their understanding of formless thought. Physical beings discovered they could learn the language of crystals and shadows. The universe had changed. Reality had expanded. And in the heart of a crystallized planet, three forms of life had learned to coexist, creating something entirely new in the process. Zara's final message wrote itself in crystal light across the chamber. In the space between shadow and light, in the moment between form and thought, in the convergence of all possibilities, we find not just survival, but transcendence. The crystal heart pulsed one final time, and the real journey began.